Okay, we'll get started. But before we kick off, I'd like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal Ngambri peoples whose country we're meeting on today, and acknowledge their unceded sovereignty and ongoing connection and custodianship to their lands and waters for the past millennia. I also acknowledge the Institute of Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions for hosting the event with Fenner School, and for Fenner School for hosting the space today. Welcome everyone, including those people we have online. It's great that people are making this seminar, which is titled Colonialism, Policy and Indigenous Governance in the Changing Anthropocene, Climate Change and Pollution. My name is Lorraine MacArthur. I'm a Renewable Energy First Nations Engagement Fellow here at the ANU with the First Nations portfolio, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before I introduce our presenters, a bit of housekeeping. Please be aware that the seminar is being recorded and will be made public after the event. If you have issues with being recorded, please contact Christian, who's in the room, and he'll assist you. For the program today, we have two speakers. Each will have 20 minutes to present. There won't be any questions in between, but we will allow a 10-minute Q&A at the end of the presentations. For those in the room, we'll have a wandering microphone, so be prepared to get the microphone. And for those joining us online, feel free to please put your questions in the chat at any time. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Fabienne, who is a PhD candidate at the Fenner School. Fabienne is a non-Indigenous French-Canadian from Quebec, specialising in interdisciplinary studies, and is committed to promoting a more just and sustainable energy transition. Her master's thesis was in environmental sciences, which explored the territorial governance of decentralised energy systems. Her findings emphasise that citizen participation, as well as state coordination, are crucial for overcoming the coherence and cohesion challenges posed by the multiplication of decentralised production sites. And it's in this context that she determined that those conclusions should be further examined within the context of Indigenous self-determination, which is the focus she is pursuing in her current doctoral research. So please welcome Fabienne, who will talk more about her investigation of pathways to decolonise the energy transition with a goal of incorporating sustainable, equitable and innovative Indigenous initiatives into effective solutions. Thanks, Fabienne.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Lorraine. I'm really excited to be here today with you to present one of the four papers that are forming my thesis by publication. So this theoretical paper proposes an alternative governance model that incorporates the self-determination claims of Indigenous peoples. So I call this the multi-territorial governance model based on international entanglement. And I'd firstly like to acknowledge that I am working and living on non-ceded Indigenous territories. And I would like to pay the profound respect that I have for their knowledges, cultures, cosmovisions, and values. So for the Nawal, Ngambri, Yanyuwa, Mara, Garwa, Gudanji, Kanyan, Keaka, and Atikamekw Rioux-Gobeil nations. I'll begin by providing an overview of the Atikamekw Rioux-Gobeil and the Garawa examples, and explaining why they have been selected for this discussion. Next, I'll outline the energy governance landscape in Canada and Australia. Following that, I'll examine existing decentralized governance models, and I'll guide you through my thought process in developing the multi-territorial governance model, the MTG. Finally, I'll conclude by exploring the potential impact of such a model on energy transitions. So I'm exploring the context of Canada and Australia as part of my doctoral research aimed at proposing pathways to decolonize energy transitions. This is a comparative case study that explores 2 renewable energy projects developed by Indigenous organizations. In Canada, in Australia, I'm working with the Aboriginal organization Original Power that is developing right now a project with the people of Borroloola, which includes 4 clans, Garoa, Yaniwa, Mara, and Budanji. They are developing a community-led microgrid solar project, the first of its kind in the Northern Territory. In Canada, I'm working with the Atikamekw Nation Council. They are developing a bioenergy project which aims to produce renewable fuels with residual forest biomass. So this project will be located on the Atikamekw-Rioux-Gobeil ancestral territory, the Nitaskinan. And since both of these projects were influenced at some point by the self-determination aspirations of the Indigenous promoters, I wanted to understand how and what was the influence. And I took 2 documents as examples, the Garowa Land and Sea Country Plan and the Atikamekw Declaration of Sovereignty. So for the Garowa people, even though the Garowa Aboriginal Land Trust of 1992 granted the Garowa traditional owners exclusive land rights over a portion of their territory, in the middle there, their consent is still not always sought, even if it should, and their role is not always understood by non-Aboriginal organizations. So the Garowa Land and Sea Country Plan was established in 2014 to clarify Garowa people's rights, interests, needs, and values. For the Atikamekw-Rioux-Gobeil people, after 25 years on unsuccessful native title negotiations with Canada and Quebec, they decided in 2014 to self-declare their sovereignty over 80,000 square kilometers of territory. This is a big red circle, which is very different from the 3 Atikamekw communities areas of Manawan, Wemontashi, and Ovijiwan, which are very small. These communities were created under the Indian Act between 1895 and 1950 through the assimilationist policy. The Canadian government has relocated many Indigenous nations in very restricted areas called reserves, most of them being nomadic people before colonization, just like the Atikamekw-Rioux-Gobeil. So what do we find in both documents? First, recognition as the Atikamekw-Rioux-Gobeil nation. And for the Garowa people, it's important that the Gyungai and Mingiringi be recognized as land manager and land owner of the Garowa country. Then consultation and consent for any projects developed on their territories. Knowledge transmission is very important for them since language and culture are rooted in their territories. Passing down this knowledge is also important for territory protection, which brings us to the 4th point. For the Atikamekw-Rioux-Gobeil, it is part of their right to protect the Nitaskinan. And it's pretty much the same thing for Garowa people. They want that their Indigenous protected area be respected by everyone. And finally, they both have their own traditional territorial governance system, customary laws, and wanted to be seen by external actors as serious and formal instances. So with this in mind, we can now examine the Canadian and Australian energy frameworks and the existing opportunities for self-determining Indigenous nations. In Canada, the governance structure for energy is one of the most decentralized in Western countries. So energy is almost strictly a provincial and territory jurisdictions. There are therefore several energy governance systems across Canada in all the provinces and territories. Some provinces like Ontario chose to implement competitive markets following the liberalization in the 90s. And other provinces like Quebec here opted for public utilities. So in Quebec, not only the governance system is public, it is also centralized. So energy flows from generation plants, almost entirely hydroelectric dams. 94% of the electricity is hydroelectric. Is from hydroelectric dams. So in central location, northern regions, 2 customers in the peripheries, southern regions on the border of the St. Lawrence River. And the electricity is managed through the state-owned entity Hydro-Québec. However, Quebec is now starting to decentralize his governance to implement various renewable sources and for other reasons of exportation and competition. So there is now electricity that can be generated from private entities, but they have to undergo the government's calls for projects and comply with very specific and severe criteria like local or Indigenous participation and like a percentage of the shares. The decentralization seems a bit smoother in Australia. Compared to Quebec, Australia is significantly more deregulated and open to competition. So to apply the 1990s liberal reforms, the national electricity market, the NEM, was established. The states in red. And to align with this, Western Australia and the Northern Territory have later on established their own electricity markets. So in the NEM, privately owned production can freely connect to the grid as long as they respect safety and stability requirements, of course. And besides the price cap, the rate depends on supply and demand. So this produces price variability across different regions in that area. And finally, the deregulation of energy governance was seen by the Australian government as a solution to the fact that in Australia, energy policies frequently overlap between states and territories and the federal level. So this is challenging sometimes as it requires for projects multiple approvals, licenses, permits at different levels of government, which consumes more time, money, and resources. However, for some other people, it's an opportunity as some states and territories can lead more efficient energy transition strategies when the national state falls short, and vice versa. And in a decentralized system, there's also off-grid production. So energy can be produced and consumed in the same geographic location. In Canada and Australia, we have very good examples of off-grid diesel generators in remote communities, mostly inhabited by Indigenous nations, Indigenous groups. So now that we know that these productions contribute greatly to greenhouse gas emissions and are more expensive for governments and communities, provincial and federal governments are seeing the need and the opportunity to transition from diesel generators to renewables in these communities. So for Indigenous peoples, this means that most of their opportunities in the Canadian and Australian energy transitions is associated with replacing diesel generators. One crucial factor driving Indigenous participation is funding, and most, if not all, in Quebec, it's all funding of the governments is associated with replacing diesel with renewables in remote communities. So in the past, in Canada, in Australia, government-led programs have shown that lack of local involvement and one-size-fits-all approach can lead to short-term longevity of projects. And now that bottom-up initiatives are gaining momentum in Australia, we continue to see challenges associated with funding, especially for innovative and first-of-their-kinds projects like the Borula project in the Northern Territory. In Canada, we see more and more partnerships with Indigenous peoples, with shares that can go up to 25% in some cases. However, if Indigenous communities would like to develop a project that is not a key in hands project, self-determined project, and a project that is not aiming to transition from diesel generators, it is a major challenge, like is experiencing right now the Atikamekw people with their bioenergy project. So the comparison between Canada and Australia indicates that decentralized governance models allow for greater diversification of actors and sources. Thus, it seems easier for Indigenous nations to contribute to such a system. As decentralization has various branches of governance model, I decided to draw on Winfield and colleagues' hierarchical and polycentric perspectives to address this diversity and identify challenges and opportunities for Indigenous people. So the hierarchical view concerns the relationships between different levels of governments. What is interesting in the Indigenous context is that it involves various levels of energy policies and aligns more closely with local realities. For the polycentric view, it focuses on multiple overlapping and horizontal spheres of authority. It supports the execution of projects at the territorial scale. So this scale is not defined by administrative borders like regions or cities. It's rather defined by the connections between biological, cultural, political, economic elements. And now for some challenges, the hierarchical model would limit Indigenous people's aspirations to the community level or the region level, which is often a creation of settler states, like we have seen with the Canadian system of reserves, and makes them dependent on higher levels of decision-making. Then the polycentric model also poses some challenges in terms of miscommunication, inconsistency among all the overlapping spheres of authority. However, in a structure that would respect and involve Indigenous self-determination claims, we must consider coordinating this system without a higher level of decision-making. So it looks like the current models lack provisions for including self-determining Indigenous nations in energy transitions. but it did also provide some very interesting insights. So drawing on these and the Garawa-Lenensi Country Plan and the Atikamekw Declaration of Sovereignty, I identified these 4 critical areas on the left: non-hierarchical relationships, territorial scale, clear national identity, and strong connections. And then, given that relationships play a significant role in governance systems, the MTG was built upon relational network theories. So by treating indigenous groups as nations, I thought that the theories of international relations would be very useful. Then in the pursuit of indigenous self-determination, it was crucial for me to delve into indigenous relational ontologies. So with the example of aboriginal relationalism, and integrate them. And finally, since indigenous nations and settler states coexist within the same territories, I thought it would be very interesting to explore the entanglement of territorialities. So in the table, these are some examples of the results that came out from the intersection of these axes. So to conclude, implementing the MTG has the potential to impact the energy transition positively in the following ways. Firstly, long-term policy planning and policy stability are crucial in energy transitions and the fight against climate change. So taking indigenous people's political and territorial claims, long-standing ones for some nations like the Atikamekw, taking this seriously now can enhance policy stability on the long term. Then additional policies targets, as we've seen, can be interesting, especially if they are more severe. So introducing a new scale, the territorial scale, could act on this. Moreover, since the territorial scale is deeply connected to culture, history, and nature, it can provide cultural legitimacy and social acceptability and sustainability to projects. Then clarifying national identities can improve interactions between indigenous nations and settler states and create sometimes a climate of certainty for investments and projects in shared space. And finally, the main distinction between private and public power productions is that the former is primarily driven by private utilities are primarily driven by economic incentives, where higher electricity consumption can lead to greater profits. And on the other hand, public utilities are expected, I really insist on expected, to consider social motivations. So the decentralization of energy systems and multiplication of private productions raise concerns about the potential loss of some of the social benefits. It is an important conversation in Quebec right now. So the MTG, on its part, emphasizes the importance of reciprocal responsibilities, relying on relationalist views, which should serve as motivating actors for taking social and environmental considerations.
Great, thanks, Fabienne. I'd now like to introduce our second presenter, Brianna Gordon, who's also a PhD candidate here at Fenner School. Brianna is a Wiradjuri descendant from central New South Wales. Her research focuses on mercury contamination from legacy gold mines and the potential impacts of contamination on Wiradjuri people's culture, community and country. Another key aspect that she folds into her research investigates how contamination may be further impacted by climate change. As an Indigenous scientist, Brianna champions traditional knowledge and Indigenous ways of learning in academia and climate change policy, both nationally and internationally. She is also a co-convener of the Indigenous student-led Fenner Circle, which provides a safe space for and advocates for Indigenous students within the Fenner School and more widely across the university. So please welcome Brianna, who will talk more about the impact of industrial pollution on the Wiradjuri people, their country, and the accumulated effect of climate change.
Yuru Marang, everyone. That means g'day in Wiradjuri. Thank you all for joining Fabienne and myself today. I have the challenging task of following up the wonderful, fabulous Fabienne, but I will do my best. This presentation today is going to be a bit casual, so everyone can chill out, take a load off. We're just going to have a bit of a yarn. And of course, by the nature of the presentation, you get to hear me yap for 20 minutes, but then I'm really keen to hear what everyone else has to say about these topics. And I do have the next hour free, so feel free to grab me and have a yap back. So before we do go any further, I do want to do my own acknowledgement of country. As Lorraine said, I'm co-convener of the Fenner Circle, which is an Indigenous student-led circle here at the ANU, but everyone is welcome to join. So if you are interested, do shoot me an email. But one thing that we try to encourage people to do is to make their acknowledgements of country unique to them. I've been fortunate enough to be living on Ngunnawal country for nearly the past 4 years now. And during that time, my appreciation for the land, waters, airs and skies of this place have only grown. Despite having lived here for nearly 4 years, I am shocked every year when summer comes around and it does actually get hot. And, you know, I started to sweat, had to walk here. I was not happy about it. Even though with the heat, I am immensely grateful to live in this beautiful place and to get to see country change with the seasons. Is because of the many millennia of love and care that the Ngunnawal people have given to this country that continues to flourish and be a home to me. And since living here, I have been honoured to know a number of Ngunnawal people firsthand, and I've got to see that love and dedication that they give to country with my own eyes. I want to acknowledge Ngunnawal elders, past and present, and thank them for their tireless work in caring for country. I also want to thank my own Wiradjuri elders for continuing to be a guide for me. And I extend these same acknowledgements, thanks and respects to the elders of the lands that those online may be joining us from, or any other Indigenous people in the room. As an Aboriginal student, I centre my work in decolonising perspectives. One of the most relevant frameworks that we'll be discussing here today is Indigenous standpoint theory, developed by Torres Strait Islander academic Martin Nakata and expanded on by Gonapul woman and Quandamooka academic Eileen Morton Robinson. This theory explains how Indigenous people exist in a contested knowledge space, the cultural interface, where our social positions, lived experiences, cultural histories shape and limit what we can know. For those of us working within Indigenous standpoint theory, true objectivity is a myth. And we can only ever speak from our own unique standpoint. So in the spirit of this theory, I'd like to introduce myself a bit personally to you all. My name is Brianna Amy Gordon. I am a 26-year-old PhD student. I am Wiradjuri, the ties to Whadjuk Noongar country, and I am also a public servant. So I should have to declare that anything said within this presentation is entirely my own thoughts and not the thoughts of the Australian government. Thank you very much. My ancestors hail from Wiradjuri country in central west New South Wales, which encompasses places like Dubbo, Wagga Wagga, Orange, Bathurst, Cowra. And Wiradjuri means the people of three rivers. And we've got the famous three rivers, the Murrumbidgee, which is the Murrumbidgee, the Galari, which is the Lachlan River, and the Womble, which is the Macquarie River. So I've introduced myself. Now let's talk about capital C country. What is capital C country? It's just, stretch land with some borders. No, but in Indigenous contexts, country is much more than a territory or land. It encompasses the spiritual, ancestral, cultural, emotional, and physical connections that we feel with the land, water, and skies. It includes the sovereignty, culture, history, and spirituality of First Nations people, all interconnected with the environment and with us. Palika woman Amberlyn Melina describes it beautifully, and I'd like to share her quote with you, and it's on the screen. For Aboriginal people, country is much more than a place. Rock, tree, river, hill, animal, human, all formed of the same substance by the ancestors who continue to live in the land, water, and sky. Country is filled with relations speaking language and following law, no matter whether the shape of that relation is human, rock, crow, wattle. Country is loved, needed, and cared for, and country loves, needs, and cares for her people in returns. Country is family, culture, identity. Country is self. Or, as Ngunnawal elder Jude Barlow puts it simply, country is everything. It's family, it's life, it's connection. When I'm on country, I feel my connection etched into my bones. The lives and stories of my ancestors are whispering through the trees on the wind. Look, if you're not a very spiritual or religious person, or you're not Indigenous, I get that all this is a little bit like woo-woo. But if you would indulge me, I would like to do a little bit of an exercise. I'm not going to make you like close your eyes or anything, so you can not do it, I won't know. But I would like, if you would be so kind, to just take a moment and picture somewhere outdoors that means something special to you. It's, your backyard, the beach you go on holidays, a park where you take your kids, or somewhere you played when you were a kid. Picture the sounds and the smells and the stories you've experienced in this place. For me, I can remember the last time I was on country and it was rainy. I can smell the petrichor and the wattle, and I can feel soil moving under me. I can hear the leaves rustling in the wind and see a little bit of light through the very, very grey skies. Think of how that place that you're imagining lives in your memory and how it connects you to others. How does this place make you feel? Now, I want you to imagine how you might feel if this place that is tied to your heart and your memory and your community, was polluted. Imagine it became unsafe to walk, swim, or play there. For me, those feelings bring up sadness, anger, and despair. When we speak of pollution on country, we're not just talking about dead fish, contaminated rivers, or lost trees. We're talking about desecration of ourselves, our cultures, our memories, and our identities. To revisit Quaimilana's words, country is self. And when country is polluted, so are we. The image on the screen is a photo I took a few months ago during my fieldwork in Hilland, north of Bathurst, on Wiradjuri country. In this image, the evidence of gold rush era gold mining is still clearly evident, with the erosion and the trees sticking out and the mud and the lack of plant growth. When I've been talking about visiting this place, I've often referred to it as being scarred, but whilst writing this presentation, I came to more of the realization that they're not in fact scars, but they're still open, gaping wounds. In this light, pollution isn't just environmental damage, it's violence. A continuation of colonisation's harm to First Nations people. With colonisation came the relentless plundering of land for resources like gold, the disregard of sustainable practices by First Nations, led by First Nations people, and an industrial expansion that valued profit over life. Recognising pollution as violence helps us see it as part of the colonial project, affecting not only physical landscapes, but the cultural and spiritual well-being of First Nations communities. The impacts of pollution on First Nations people and country are myriad and diverse. Australian First Nations people, especially those living in remote areas, experience more negative health outcomes associated with pollution compared to the general population and compared to First Nations people in urban areas. These include cancer, respiratory disease, cardiovascular issues, bacterial infections, and depression, among other negative mental health outcomes. Pollution on country can also lead to the destruction of cultural, camping and hunting sites, the restriction of access to places of spiritual and cultural significance, a disruption of cultural obligations, and an inability to continue to care for country. I'm going to share a couple of case studies really quickly with you, just a little oversight. But I do want to clarify that I'm not a cultural authority on any of these topics. Only going back to standpoint theory that we discussed earlier, as a Wiradjuri woman, I can only truly know what is experienced by me and my country. If any of these case studies are interesting to you and you want to know more, I really do encourage you to have a look and see if you can seek out the direct voices and experiences of those whose country has been directly impacted in these particular stories. And as I'm sharing them, keep in mind that they have been presented through an academic and journalistic lens, and that in itself means that some of this knowledge has been repurposed from its original intentions. One of the most prominent examples that we're going to start off with is the Ranger uranium mine on Mirarr country in the Northern Territory. Controversial. Since the 1970s, Mirarr people have been vocal in their opposition to the mine, expressing frustrations that their wishes have been disregarded by governments, regulators, and operators. In 2013, a massive spill of uranium slurry occurred, and though this was the largest spill to date, it was one of over 200 in the history of the mine. So really just, business as usual. Despite the mine's closure in 2021 and continual cleanup efforts, authorities still claim that there is no lasting environmental harm, yet they have disregarded, and in some places seem to have deliberately ignored, the health impacts felt by Mirarr people and the spiritual wounds inflicted on country. Cancer rates and fetal death are significantly higher in First Nations communities near the Ranger mine compared to other First Nations communities in the Northern Territory. There has been a consistent burden of proof on these communities to prove that these negative health outcomes could even be partially attributed to environmental pollution rather than solely lifestyle choices. There's also a failure to recognise that these health impacts that are often labelled as lifestyle choices can be symptoms of an unequal society in which First Nations people have had their cultural and family ties disrupted or ignored, or where they continue to be marginalised by wider society and the power structures at play. When speaking on the impacts of the mine, Mirarr senior traditional owner Yvonne Marurula had this to say. Uranium mining has also taken our country away from us and destroyed it. Billabongs and creeks are gone forever. There are hills of poisonous rock and great holes in the ground with poisonous mud where there used to be nothing but bush. The case study of the Ranger uranium mine and the harm that is brought to Mirarr traditional owners is a bit of a textbook example as to how Western governments is ill-equipped to manage the complexities and realities of pollution on country. Numerous policies govern pollution, environmental protection, and First Nations rights at both state and federal levels within Australia. These overlapping and interweaving policies create a complex web of laws that can create blind spots and vacuums in regards to obligations and responsibilities for pollution management and protection. In the example of the Ranger mine, which was originally authorised under the Atomic Energy Act, there was actually no provisions mandating the closure, monitoring or compliance of the mine in the Northern Territory. And when they first came out with the plan, they had to base it off the WA one. Additionally, Western government structures genuinely fail to incorporate First Nations knowledge, needs and cultural obligations within their environmental policies, and instead, as we all kind of know, I think, focus largely on measurable qualitative data with clear economic decision-making power or value, and these decisions are ultimately made at the minister or government's behest. As these policies are often intended to be applicable nationally or statewide, they're also often broad and address environmental issues separately rather than as an interconnected system. And they don't address human and environmental health as one and the same. Western environmental governments is also subject to increasing politicisation, where action or inaction on key issues like climate change can be considered based on the opinions of donors or how it may influence voting in the short term rather than for the needs of country. I think after last night's news, not naming any names, we might have an understanding of what that might mean for environmental policy on a global scale. An example in the Australian context of some policy not being fit for purpose for First Nations people is the National Environmental Protection Measure of 1999, which is authorised under the National Environmental Protection Council Act of 1994. The National Environmental Protection Measure does not include or reference any consideration of First Nations people or culture within its guidance on assessing the potential chemical contamination of the site, nor does it account for the interconnectedness of people and country when determining the risk level of a known chemical pollutant in a given place. And when I say it doesn't reference it, I mean it doesn't reference it. The words are not included in the measure at all. And that's well over 1,000 pages. Conversely, whilst Indigenous governance is not a monolith, as different communities and people will have different governance structures and policies based on their needs and resources, there are some general commonalities that we see amongst Indigenous governance structures. One thing that sets Indigenous governance structures apart is that country, community and culture as an interconnected being is given the highest priority for protection. Indigenous governance also relies equally on modern scientific techniques and traditional ecological knowledge that has been passed down for millennia to make decisions on how to care for country. This traditional ecological knowledge most often allows First Nations people to understand the specific needs of country the best, as they are the ones interacting, caring for, and connecting with country on a daily basis. Now, this is not to say at all that existing Western governance structures can never be to the benefit of Indigenous governance and the protection of country. So one example where it was a little bit helpful was in August of this year. The Wiradjuri Traditional Owners Central West Aboriginal Corporation, or TACWOC, was successful in its bid under Section 10 of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act, which allows First Nations people to make an application to protect an area from the impact of a development. Lodged in October 2020, so it did take almost 4 years, the application stated that the Belubula headwaters of the Belubula River in New South Wales are extremely culturally important to Wiradjuri people, which is my people, in case you've got. By being successful in their application, the TACWOC has prevented the construction of a mine waste storage site that was to be constructed on the river's headwaters. The storage of the mine waste on the headwaters presented a significant risk of heavy metal pollution to the waterway, which would compound environmental issues already being felt due to ongoing climate change. I was lucky enough to be in the room when it was announced by the TACWOC elders that this application had been successful, and the relief was palpable. There was an immediate energy shift within the audience, and people were crying. This meant so much, and it had been such a difficult 4-year-long fight. This success was only possible due to the governance structures of Wotjokwak, which directed and devoted significant labour and resources, much of that labour being given for free by Indigenous people and their allies, to collect information and put together the application and to continually fight for it to be granted for those 4 years. Despite achieving success in this instance, the process and the fallout of the successful application has highlighted some ongoing issues within prevailing Western environmental government structures that ultimately control the fate of country. Under the ATSHIP Act, Section 10 gives the Federal Environment Minister the discretion to make a declaration that protects significant First Nations areas and objects from destruction. Once an application is made, the Minister must appoint an independent person to prepare a report on the application. This involves inviting representatives from all interested parties, which includes the developers. This process puts significant burden of proof on First Nations applicants to prove the site's cultural significance and to disclose protected information in order to prove that significance. For First Nations people without sufficient resourcing or labour to meet this burden of proof, the chances of their application being granted become very slim. The application process also exposes the applicants to backlash and pressure from developers who are also significantly better funded and resourced. This situation has, quite predictably, sparked condemnation from the New South Wales Mineral Council, who has decried that the situation has set a dangerous precedent because country and culture were prioritised in this instance over industry and economic interests. Because Indigenous governance structures are community and country-based, they are the systems that are best equipped to tackle local problems quickly. An excellent example of the effectiveness of Indigenous governance structures in immediately tackling pollution is the continual work of the Dirramu Aboriginal corporations and the Dirramu Rangers, cleaning, removing and monitoring plastic pollution on East Arnhem Land beaches. These beaches are key ecological sites for native animals, including endangered marine turtles and seabirds. Plastic fishing and domestic waste from the Arafura Sea continually wash up on beaches like Julpan. Plastic pollution is a hazard for aquatic species that become tangled in the waste or are ingesting the microplastics or have their food sources smothered by literal mountains of plastic waste. The plastic can also leach high amounts of hazardous chemicals, including heavy metals, which is my area of study, into the ecosystem, which again, like the previous example, is also struggling under the impacts of climate change. Since the 1990s, the Dirramu Rangers have been implementing policies and practices to preserve their beaches, working with universities and NGO partners to regularly deploy cleanup operations. And one example from 2022, over just 10 days, with 10 rangers and 11 volunteers cleaned up 10 tonnes of plastic waste from only a 4.5 kilometre stretch of beach. It is sadly common to find animals trapped in the waste. Sometimes, if they get to them quickly enough and the animals are lucky, they can be freed and released. But it is also quite common to find the corpses of these animals rotting amongst the plastic. In September of this year, several Dirramu Rangers travelled to Canberra to petition the government to step up to do more to stop the incoming wave of plastic pollution from the ocean and to urge the government to recognise that collaborative Indigenous-led measures are required to tackle the plastic pollution crisis across the region. I've just got some numbers there of the immense amounts of different types of plastic items that they picked up in just 11 days. Again, in only 4.5 kilometres. If you are an exerciser, which I am not, you probably run that every day. So you can think about the amount of plastic that's just in that small little area. We're almost done, doing amazing. In speaking about plastic pollution, the plastic pollution crisis on East Arnhem Land beaches, Dirramu Managing Director Timmy Burrawonga said, "This country is our country. Our problems are your problems. Your problems are our problems. Let's create something in this country, a better country of ours. Come and help us in this struggle. This quote kind of beautifully encapsulates this entire point of this little yarn I've been having with you, that you've been very gracious in allowing me to have. And what I think we can do can be moving forward to address pollution and continue to protect and care for country. I hope that I have started and sparked some interest in you in this short time in how our current governmental systems of pollution management can be insufficient to safeguard country, culture and community, leaving the majority of the work to be undertaken by First Nations people. And despite being under-resourced and underfunded, First Nations environmental policies and governance structures are spearheading pollution management and protection in this nation. As academics or whoever you are or might be online, working in this space, I think that we need to be vocal in our support, and if possible with maybe some grants or other things, financially support this effort through ethical and equitable research partnerships. We can work directly with First Nations communities to reduce the workload that they are forced to undertake and help alleviate the burden of proof put upon them to see action under our current government policies. We can use our positions, as for me at least, an academic here in Canberra, to draw attention to their work. Oh, well, yeah, I'm doing that right now. And aid them in producing the valuable data, tools and labour that they need to implement their governance structures and policies on a wider scale. If anything I've said today sparks some questions for you or has intrigued you, I encourage you to think about how your research or your work could be enhanced to aid First Nations people in enacting ongoing environmental governance structures and policies in the hopes that we can move towards an Australian policy framework that meets the needs of country and people as one. And I've got the next hour free as well. So after the question time, you're more than free to grab me and have a yarn about what you think. So Mandangu, which is thank you in Wiradjuri, and thank you all very much for allowing me to come up and have a yap at you.
Yes, there's a total cultural clash between two groups, which creates dysfunction within our society. So it seems to be the question of something like a treaty that lays out the groundwork for how various decisions are made.
Well, wouldn't you know, I'm in support of a treaty. But you are very right. There is a lot of difficulties for government and academics and industry who, regardless of their intentions, often people with very good intentions who want to go and work in this space, who don't have the cultural competency or understanding to be able to have a proper relationship that's based on respect and mutual understanding. So obviously one thing that we sort of do in the Fenner Circle is that we try to increase people's cultural competency and recommend various papers and resources that people can use. But I'm glad that you did highlight that, yes, there can often be a significant cultural clash. And I think it is up to us as the people often with the resources and the money and who historically have had the power in these relationships to address that power imbalance and ensure that we are doing the work to make sure that we can bridge those cultural gaps and that we are meeting First Nations people where they need us to be.
Any other questions?
In times where intimidation and harm has been preferred to country, how who should accept blame for that? Obviously, there's the people with this, but those don't exist anymore. Goes down. So in cases like that, where should the blame lie? Is that on governments or individuals?
That's such a good point, and it's a big, it factors into my research specifically. My actual PhD work is looking at gold rush era gold mining, and obviously the people who did that pollution are not around anymore. And so there is a lot of blame that does fall on the government, especially if this is things that have happened within the 20th century. We do have to own up to the fact that whatever policy or legislation was in place at the time was not sufficient and that the government had a duty of care to ensure that country and people, I mean, it gets complicated legally, and I'm no lawyer because, of course, we weren't citizens up until a certain point in the 20th century, but that people and the land of that we call Australia is protected. But it also, I think, parallels to colonisation in general, where we may not have been the ones who, you know, and when I say we, I mean sort of society, Australian society at large, may not have been the ones who perpetrated the horrors of colonisation, but we still benefit from it. And when it comes to pollution from industrial works and minings, that wealth that was generated, someone is still benefiting from it, and oftentimes it is the Australian public in general. And also, you know, the certain tippy tops of Australian society, we'll say. And so I do think that we have to reckon with the fact that they do need to accept some culpability of what happened. And beyond accepting culpability, we need to understand that something needs to be done. If pollution has occurred, and if it is possible to rectify that pollution and clean it up, I'm less interested in blame and more interested in getting it done. And in instances where it's not possible to clean it up, which is very common in certain cases, like with heavy metals, it's about understanding what practices need to be in place to keep people safe, and ensuring in whatever way we can that cultural practices and obligations can continue on without harm from that pollution coming back onto the individuals practicing those cultural practices.
I did get like too focused on like, oh, everything's wrong with the world, and like forget about the solutions, or like if you don't like how to find a balance between like there is hope and then like researching everything that's and find balance.
Yeah, it's hard sometimes when you're just reading like negative stuff. But honestly, like with the people with whom I'm working, like the Atikamekw people and the people in Borula, they are mostly really positive about their project, even if they have injured way worse than what I can imagine for the Atikamekw. I'll talk mostly about the Atikamekw people because I've been working with them most for now. But yeah, they are really positive about what they are doing with their bioenergy project. They are seeing like with this project, they will build like a management center for the whole territory, the 80,000 square kilometers, to manage the resource, to inventory the resource, and to, they hope, have a little bit more control over their territory and their resources. So yes, at the start, it looks negative, but when you work on this, there's so many like inspiring projects, and it's mostly positive.
And thank you for your question. That is a very real thing, I think, that academics struggle with, especially in this field, that trying to find that balance between the doom and gloom of what we research and having hope for the future, especially as things do oftentimes tend to be getting worse. I think for me, there's always faith, then there's always hope. You can't have light without dark. And I'm not a true believer in my in Wiradjuri Dreamtime beliefs, but there is faith in those stories that country and our ancestors will always continue on. They are timeless. They've been here for time immemorial, and my actions and the actions of mankind, I don't things will change and things will get hard, but we will find, I believe, and I have to have that hope that we will continue on. And I think sometimes it is a choice to have hope. It is a choice to not allow yourself to succumb to the negativity and to the doom. Because truthfully, if you do, then you stop trying, you stop researching, you stop advocating. And that's what, you know, the big oil giants and the billionaires of the world, 3 guesses as to my political affiliations, that's what they want. And so hope is a radical thing, and it is an important thing. And if there is one thing that you can do as someone who cares about the planet and cares about other people, it is to have hope.
Thank you. I just note we're out of time, but if you do have further questions, these guys I think will be around. Otherwise, we'll, you know, dump them online outside of this forum. I'd just like to again thank the conveners, the hosts of this, and you know the staff that have helped out to convene this seminar. And I'm sure everyone will agree, special acknowledgement to our speakers and Fabienne for their presentation. So thank you.
And thank you to Lorena, our wonderful MC.